It began in Wiltshire, in the village of Compton Basset, though no one there much remembered when Tobias first began learning to make shoes. The year was 1287, or thereabouts, and the mornings were often damp, the kind of damp that seeps in through the thatch and lingers on the wooden beams until long past midday. Chickens wandered freely outside the small family cottage, and the hearth smoke smelled faintly of moss. Tobias was 12, or perhaps 13. No one had written it down, and he was already spending his days bent over bits of stiff, waxed leather. His father, Harold Cartwright, was not especially known for skill or personality, but his shoes were solid, and they rarely creaked. That was enough to keep the work steady. Harold spoke little, preferring to let the tools do most of the talking. He would tap in nails with a rhythmic patience that seemed to slow time itself. Tobias listened closely to the way his father sighed before stitching, as if bracing himself for the same step he'd taken every day for the last 30 years. The workshop wasn't really a shop. It was a lean-to room, added to the side of the cottage, its walls cluttered with wooden forms, worn awls, and bits of twine. A small window let in pale gray light, often softened by the fog. In the corner was a low stool with one leg shorter than the others. Tobias learned early to sit just slightly forward to keep it from wobbling. Most days began the same. Bread, somewhat stale, a spoon of onions if they were lucky, then the soft creak of the bench as Tobias and his father took their places. They did not speak much, only when something was off, if the sole wasn't holding its curve or the thread was fraying in the wrong spot. Otherwise, it was the rasp of the knife against leather, the soft clack of wooden lasts, and the tap-tap of pegs being driven home. When Tobias asked why they used elmwood pegs instead of iron nails, his father simply said, "Because feet swell." That was all the explanation he gave. But years later, Tobias would still remember it. The shoes themselves were simple, turn shoes, mostly, made inside out then flipped. This style had been common for generations, and no one saw much reason to change it. The villagers wore them until the stitching failed, or the leather cracked, or they simply forgot where they'd left them. Every now and then someone would ask for a fancier pair, maybe for a wedding, but mostly they just wanted something to keep the mud out. Tobias learned to soften the hides with urine, then rinse them in the stream behind the barley fields. He didn't mind the smell. Not after the first year. It was simply part of the work. Sometimes he watched as a single hide floated downstream when he wasn't careful. His father never scolded him for that. "Another will come," was all he said. There was a traveling cobbler who passed through once or twice a year, and he wore brighter clothing than anyone in Compton Basset. He brought odd tools and strange techniques. He'd talk about curled soles from Milan or decorative stitching from Bruges. Tobias listened, but his father did not. Harold thought flourishes were for people who didn't have to walk far. As the months turned into years, Tobias's hands grew call-used and precise. He could cut a sole to fit a foot he hadn't even seen, just based on the smudges left behind in the dust near the church. He learned to spot the difference between sheep leather and goat just by smell, and he began to write small notes on bits of scrap parchment. "Mr. Dobbins favors wider toes or left foot slightly longer. Don't mention it." He kept these notes in a pouch by his cot, not because they were necessary. People came when they needed shoes, and they didn't expect perfection, but because Tobias liked the idea of remembering. One autumn, when the leaves went dull instead of golden, Tobias stitched a pair of boots for himself. He had never done so before, They were plain, of course, and the left one pinched slightly near the arch, but when he walked in them across the muddy lane, he felt for the first time that he was not simply learning, he was making. At night, he began to dream about tools, not grand dreams, just slow, repetitive ones. A hammer rising and falling, a needle threading through dark leather, the faint warmth of the fire as the glue softened. By the time he was 16, no one remembered a time when Tobias hadn't been a shoemaker, not even Tobias. And so the years continued. The same stool, the same tools, the same rhythm of days, shaped by worn leather and gentle repetition. Tobias Cartwright's 20s came and went with little fuss. No major illness, no lost tools, no unexpected trips beyond the parish. The lane outside his home grew deeper with ruts as oxen dragged the same cartloads of hay back and forth year after year. Meanwhile, inside the lean-to workshop, Tobias stitched, cut, tapped, and mended, one sole at a time. His father, Harold, continued working beside him, though he spoke even less than before. He'd begun wearing 2 pairs of socks, even in summer, and sometimes paused mid-stitch, not to think, but simply because his fingers preferred stillness. Tobias noticed these things, though he never commented. Instead, he adjusted his own rhythm to fill the silence. If Harold was slow with nails, Tobias laid out the next pair's leather early. If Harold forgot which shoe was left and which was right, Tobias quietly turned them the right way round. The work itself had its own memory. No task ever had to be explained more than once. A torn strap meant beeswax and thread. A warped sole meant soaking and reshaping. A pair of boots left too long by the fire would always curl at the toe, and there was nothing to be done about it. They kept a little wooden board near the door where clients would scratch their names if they needed shoes made or mended. Sometimes the names stayed there for weeks before anyone came to collect. Tobias found it calming to check the board each morning. Sometimes no new marks had appeared. Other times the same person had scratched their name twice, forgetting they'd already done so. The village changed slowly, like butter left out in cool weather. A new vicar arrived one spring and spoke more briskly than the last. A dog went missing and returned 4 days later. Tobias noted these changes, but didn't feel changed by them. He began keeping a small tally of his shoes, not for accounting really, just for the quiet pleasure of knowing. By his 30th year, he'd made 411 pairs. He'd mended another 128. He had no idea if this was a large number or a small one, and he didn't care. He marked them all on a bit of scrap parchment with a dot and a line. When the parchment got full, he began another. The leather came from 3 main sources: the tanner at the edge of the village, the traveling merchant from Devizes, and sometimes a sheep farmer who'd taken to curing hides in his barn. Tobias found the barn hides too stiff, but he never said so aloud. He simply used them for the back parts of boots where stiffness was useful. One particularly rainy year, 1321, according to a local with a good memory, Tobias spent 3 straight weeks working only by firelight. The rain pattered against the shutters day and night, and the stream behind the house overflowed slightly into the lane. During that time, he found his hands growing slower but more careful. He liked how the firelight softened the flaws in the leather. Small scars, nicks, and stretch marks looked gentler in the amber glow. The village children sometimes came to watch him work. He didn't mind. They asked questions about the tools, the thread, the smell. He explained what he could and left out what he didn't know. He didn't know, for instance, why some shoes squeaked, even when made carefully. Some leather wants to be noisy, he told them, and they accepted that. Tobias never married. He shared a house with his father until Harold Sip's fingers stopped stitching altogether. When that happened, the old man simply sat near the hearth, listening to the wind, occasionally nodding toward the workbench, as if to say, Tobias always had. Eventually, Harold passed away during an afternoon nap. There was no ceremony, just a gathering of neighbors, a few shared loaves of rye bread, and someone mentioning that Harold had been good with boots. Tobias cleaned the workbench that evening with a damp cloth and replaced his father's seat with a crate of scrap wood. In the years that followed, Tobias worked alone. The shop felt quieter, but the tools still made their sounds. The rasping of the awl, the tug of thread through damp holes, the occasional grunt when a stubborn sole refused to lie flat. He found comfort in those sounds. Every now and then, someone would ask if he was training an apprentice. Tobias would shrug. Haven't had reason. And that was that. He developed a fondness for goat leather in his 40s, finding it softer to the touch. He began experimenting quietly with small flourishes, a bit of extra stitching on the upper flap, a curved seam near the heel. Nothing too bold, just enough to keep his fingers curious. He never signed his work, never raised his prices, but he did begin keeping a small book, a real one, with stitched pages, where he drew sketches of shoes he liked. Some were his, some were imagined, some he wasn't quite sure where he'd seen. He kept the book under his cot and flipped through it on rainy mornings, sometimes just to look at the shapes. He also started visiting the church more often, not for prayer, exactly, but for the echo. He liked how his boots sounded on the stone floor. He'd sit on the back pew and let the echoes fade slowly, like smoke. The quiet years passed that way, steadily, peacefully, with no real ambition, but no regret either. Each day offered a task or two, a heel to patch, a strap to replace, a few names on the board. Nothing urgent, nothing surprising. And Tobias liked it that way. By the time Tobias turned 60, the village had changed just enough to notice. There were more carts now, and fewer people walking barefoot. A few households had started ordering boots from the market in Devizes, where a merchant claimed his were machine-cut, though no one could quite say what that meant. Tobias didn't mind. Fewer orders meant more time to sit by the fire with his scrap leather notebook, adding slow, uneven sketches of buckles and boots he never planned to make. His fingers had stiffened slightly. He noticed it most on cold mornings, when tying knots took twice as long, and the awl slipped more often than it used to. But the tools still fit his hands. The stool still wobbled. The workbench still carried the scent of beeswax and old polish. He didn't stop working all at once. There was no decision, no line drawn. He simply took fewer orders, left the board by the door blank for longer stretches. When people knocked to ask if he was still taking repairs, he would say, "Only the simple ones." That seemed to satisfy everyone. Most days, Tobias still wandered into the workshop. Sometimes he would mend a torn strap or finish a pair he'd started weeks earlier. Other times, he would sit with his notebook and copy a boot he'd seen in a dream, one with impossible curves or 3 rows of stitching no foot would ever need. He didn't show these drawings to anyone. By now, the village knew him more as a fixture than a figure. The older residents remembered his father. The younger ones assumed Tobias had always been there, tapping away behind the shutters, making shoes for people they'd never met. Once a month, without fail, he walked the perimeter of the village in his own boots. The same pair he'd made for himself at 16, now mended so many times the original sole was long gone. He liked the feel of the lane beneath him, the way the gravel crunched differently after rain. One autumn, the parish held a small gathering, more a potluck than a feast, and someone brought up Tobias's shoes. Still the quietest ones, they said. Don't squeak. A few nodded. Tobias smiled slightly, though he didn't say anything. He had become the sort of man people waved to from across the square. They didn't stop to chat, but they waved, which was enough. On market days when he did walk into town, someone always offered him a plum or a piece of barley bread. He accepted these gifts with quiet thanks and kept walking. In his final years, Tobias taught no apprentice, though a boy named Ellis came by now and then to watch. Tobias didn't correct him much. He let Ellis figure out the grain of the leather on his own, let him miscut a few pieces. You'll feel it when it's wrong, Tobias said, and then you'll start feeling when it's right. He never said goodbye to the workshop, never cleared the bench. When he stopped working, it simply sat untouched, collecting dust and holding its shape, like an old tree stump no one bothers to move. When Tobias passed away one winter morning, quietly without struggle, in the same bed where he had once sketched out his first designs, the village clerk recorded it in a narrow ledger. Tobias Cartwright, shoemaker, age uncertain, known to many, shoes fit well. No one built a statue. There was no plaque, but for a while afterward, people who wore his boots noticed how well they held up in wet weather. And now and then, someone would glance at a scuffed heel and say, that was Tobias Sipp's work, wasn't sipped it. And that was enough. And so, the shoemaker of Wiltshire was quietly folded into the village's memory, like a well-patched sole tucked under a heavy cloak. No one kept all his shoes. Most were worn through, left in corners, or handed down until they fell apart. But the memory of his work lingered in the quiet details, in the soft way boots met the ground, in the sturdy seams that didn't split even after a dozen winters. Tobias Cartwright did not change the world. He simply shaped leather, day after day, with care and rhythm and little fuss. And perhaps that was enough. Sleep now, knowing that someone, somewhere, once spent his whole life doing one thing well and never hurried once. Southwark in the late 14th century was not quite London, but not quite the countryside either. It sat just across the River Thames, connected to the city by the old London Bridge, which always smelled faintly of fish, damp stone, and boiled wool. The streets were never clean, but never especially filthy either, just busy in a quiet sort of way, as if the place itself knew it wasn't the center of anything, but still mattered enough to keep its shoes tied. In a crooked building, tucked between a tavern and a cooper's yard, a woman named Marjorie Tallow kept records. She was the local clerk, self-appointed at first, then gradually accepted. She copied tax rolls, tenant lists, and receipts of payment, not because anyone asked her to. She simply began doing it, and no one had the energy to stop her. Her writing desk was a long slab of oak, uneven at one end and supported by a stack of old cider crates. She had 3 quills, 2 functional, one mostly for show, and a small jar of lamp-black ink that always seemed to dry out on feast days. There was no real filing system. She sorted documents by size, weight, and smell. Letters that smelled like vinegar were usually urgent. Those that smelled like mutton had often already been paid. Marjorie was not especially sociable, but people trusted her. She wore the same gray shawl nearly every day, and her boots made no sound on the floorboards. When she passed through the market, people gave her space, not out of fear, but out of habit. They knew she remembered things, especially numbers, especially debts. Her office walls were lined with shelves made from leftover shipping crates. On them sat hundreds of little bundles, each tied with bits of string, wool, or once dried celery stalks. The bundles held scraps of parchment, torn receipts and careful lists in her looping script. Some were inventories of barley sacks or goat rentals. Others were notations like, John of Turnfield owes 6pence, has not paid, claims illness, observed walking briskly. She wrote in ink when possible, in charcoal when not. Her hands were always smudged. The room smelled of paper, oil, and dust. Always dust. It gathered in corners like shy cats and crept between the pages of her ledgers. Sometimes Marjorie wiped it away. More often, she simply let it settle. Dust is a kind of record, she once said to a visiting friar who didn't understand what she meant. Each morning began the same. She would sweep her hand across the top of the desk, not to clean it, just to make a space, and then reach for the pile that looked most pressing. She didn't sort by date. She sorted by how the paper curled at the edges. New complaints curled outward. Old debts curled in. People came to her office when they didn't know where else to go. Disputes over pig ownership, arguments about chimney placement, or requests for backdated receipts. She never gave advice. She only read the records and pointed. According to this, she would say, you already agreed to the chicken, or the fence was declared mutual property in Candlemas 2 years past. Her tone was not stern, but immovable. The ledger she used most often was bound in old leather, with a loop of faded red thread holding it shut. It contained the yearly tax assessments for the parish, written in tight slanted lines with little symbols in the margins. A fish meant payment made in kind. A boot indicated delayed payment due to travel. A small drawing of a feather signified an excuse involving poetry, which Marjorie never quite trusted. She kept track of it all. She noted who paid on time, who didn't, and who claimed they had but offered no proof. Proof, to Marjorie, came in the form of receipts, scraps, or memories that matched hers. She trusted no one's memory more than her own. Once, a merchant tried to bribe her with a wheel of soft cheese to change a number. She took the cheese, wrote attempted cheese bribe in the margin, and left the number unchanged. There was little glamour in her work. Her only real decoration was a dried sprig of lavender pinned above the ledger shelf. It had been there for years. She no longer remembered who gave it to her, but it still smelled faintly of soap. Her windows faced east, and she liked how the morning light landed on the stacks of parchment, making them glow ever so slightly, like embers with nothing left to burn. On cold mornings, she kept her ink near the hearth to keep it flowing. On warm ones, she opened the shutters and let in the sounds of horses and arguing. She did not keep a cat. She claimed they knocked things over. Once, on a particularly slow morning, she spent an hour redrawing a list of tax codes, simply to make the spacing better. No one saw it. No one commented. But Marjorie found that looking at a neatly spaced list made her feel something close to contentment. And so the days went on, quiet, repetitive, and oddly satisfying. The ink would run out. She would mix more. The tax rolls would grow. She would copy them again. The dust would gather. She would let it. No one questioned how she came to be the keeper of records. It was simply known that if you needed to know something in Southwark, you asked Marjorie Tallow. And if she didn't know, she would tell you exactly why she didn't, and point you towards someone who might. She never raised her voice, never hurried, and never misplaced a document she considered important. And so, in a crooked building off a side street in Southwark, amid bundles of parchment, the faint smell of vinegar, and an ever-present layer of dust, Marjorie Tallow quietly built one of the most accurate, if uncelebrated, tax archives in all of medieval England. The matter of the pigeons began, as many things did in Southwark, with a single complaint delivered too late. One morning, just after the feast of St. Dunstan, a thin man with a crooked nose and a leather apron knocked on Marjorie's door, holding a scrap of parchment that had been folded and unfolded too many times. His name was Godric Blay, and he kept a small grain shop 3 doors down from the apothecary. He claimed firmly but without heat that the pigeons roosting on the church roof were eating more than their share of the barley he left out to dry behind his shop. He suspected, he said, that someone was keeping the pigeons on purpose, possibly for meat, possibly for message carrying, possibly, he added darkly, for reasons unknown. Marjorie listened, offered him a chair which he refused, and then opened the leather-bound tax ledger to the back section, where she kept her notes on complaints related to animals. There were separate columns for dogs, oxen, goats, and miscellaneous fowl. The latter included chickens, ducks, and now pigeons. She made a new entry, 12th of May, year of our Lord 1381. Mr. Blay alleges pigeons eating trade barley. Suggest inquiry into ownership. She wrote slowly, pausing between each word to sharpen her quill, though it hardly needed it. Mr. Blay stood in silence the entire time, shifting his weight and occasionally glancing at the lavender sprig pinned above the hearth. When he left, Marjorie returned to her list of overdue flower levies. She thought little more of it. But the next week, another complaint arrived. This one from widow Elfreda, who claimed the same pigeons were relieving themselves on her laundry line with increasing precision. She suggested, rather indirectly, that someone might be encouraging them. She did not name names, but made several vague references to grain merchants with motives. Marjorie recorded that as well. In the margins, she drew a small symbol of a feather, her notation for situations likely to involve exaggeration. By midsummer, 6 more complaints had been filed. A boy bitten, a roof dirtied, a prayer disrupted by fluttering wings. The pigeons, it seemed, had become a topic of general concern. And so, at the next parish council meeting, held in the back of the cooper's shed, because the church was being re-whitewashed, Marjorie brought her bundle of notes and quietly suggested that the pigeons be formally counted. The idea was met with long silence, followed by a few thoughtful nods. Then someone asked, "And who would do the counting?" Marjorie did not volunteer. Instead, she recommended John of Penhurst, a quiet young man who swept the church steps and once claimed to know how to mimic pigeon sounds. The council accepted this without discussion. Over the next fortnight, John produced a list of 12 pigeons, 9 gray, 2 brown, 1 white, with a limp. He believed they were not wild, but trained. He also believed they were not from Southwark. Their flight patterns are too deliberate, he said, though no one asked him to elaborate. This was enough to stir speculation. People began watching the rooftops more closely. Someone swore they saw a boy in Bermondsey toss crumbs in a deliberate circle. Another claimed a pigeon flew in a perfect square, which was taken as a sign of military training. Marjorie kept writing. She compiled the complaints into a separate ledger, labeling it pigeon-related matters, general and specific. The pages filled slowly with neat lines, names, dates, locations, and observations, such as 7 pigeons observed at dusk on the gable of Tanner's Hall stayed precisely 11 minutes. Old Bishop Fenn called them a punishment for pride, then tripped on a cobblestone. Laundry affected, 3 lines in total, 2 white shirts, 1 apron, minor soiling. Despite the growing chatter, no one proposed any action. No fines, no cages, no official decrees. Instead, the town settled into a comfortable rhythm of mild annoyance. The pigeons came and went. People watched and muttered. Children began naming them. Marjorie, for her part, continued documenting. She added a new symbol to her marginalia, a small looping spiral to indicate complaints that would likely lead nowhere. One day, without explanation, the pigeons left, or rather, most of them did. A few lingered, but the congregation dispersed. Whether due to weather, feed changes, or simple boredom, no one knew. The complaints stopped. The pages in the ledger stopped, but Marjorie did not forget. She tied the bundle of pigeon records with a piece of blue twine and shelved it between wool tariffs, minor complaints involving bread shape. She added a small note to the cover. Resolved by absence, cause unknown, may recur. Years later, someone would find the bundle and ask what it was. Marjorie, now older and slower with her ink, would say it was a dispute about pigeons. It passed, and that was all. As for Mr. Blay, he eventually built a small canopy over his drying trays. Widow Elfrida began drying her laundry indoors, and John of Penhurst, the pigeon counter, developed a short-lived interest in ducks, which never became a public issue. And the town of Southwark, having survived the pigeon episode without injury or verdict, quietly resumed its usual rhythm of complaints, confusion, and the occasional, well-documented sneeze. By the turn of the century, Marjorie Tallow had become as much a part of Southwark as the worn cobbles and the smell of damp grain. She still worked in the same crooked building, its beams now more bent than before, its shutters hanging a little looser. The ink on her earliest records had begun to fade, but she remembered the numbers by heart. Her hands, though slower, still moved with purpose. Each entry was written with care, spaced evenly, as though each numeral needed room to breathe. Her handwriting once crisp and narrow, had grown a bit more rounded, not from error, but from patience. She said less aloud these days. People still came to her for records, for clarifications, or just to be reminded that they had indeed paid what they claimed to have paid. Marjorie never challenged them directly. She simply consulted her ledgers. Most of the time, the answers were there, filed, indexed in her own way, folded into bundles labeled with phrases like minor grain sales, autumnal, or disputes involving tins, ongoing. The room smelled the same as always. Ink, paper, and the faint sourness of dried parchment. The lavender sprig above the shelf had turned entirely gray, but she left it there. Its shadow on the wall was now more vivid than the plant itself. Some afternoons she simply sat and listened to the building, its soft creaks, the flap of a curtain, the whisper of a paper sliding ever so slightly under its own weight. She claimed these sounds helped her think, though often she didn't need to think at all. Her hands knew what needed doing. One winter, the river froze over longer than usual. The bridge to London turned slick with frost, and fewer people made the crossing. Marjorie used the quiet to reorganize her records. She revised her index to include a new category: matters delayed by weather. There were more of them than she expected. It was around this time she began forgetting small things, not names or debts, those she remembered with ease, but smaller details, whether she had already counted a page, whether a particular parchment belonged in the settled or unsettled pile. She began tying small knots in the corners of papers to remind herself what had been checked. No one noticed at first. The work continued. The complaints were filed, the taxes were listed, but Marjorie herself began to move more slowly, not in body, but in attention. Sometimes she would read the same line twice, sometimes 3 times. One foggy morning, she left the front door ajar. A stray cat wandered in and sat politely beside the hearth. Marjorie did not shoo it away. It didn't knock anything over. Eventually, she began spending her mornings copying her favorite entries into a separate book. Not the newest ones, not the most useful, just the ones she liked. A misfiled complaint about a missing spoon, a finely worded dispute about alley boundaries, a merchant who paid in chestnuts instead of coin and insisted they be weighed precisely. She called it her book of odd and satisfying things, though no one else ever read it. She stitched it herself with soft leather and a crooked spine and stored it under the hearthstones where the ink kept from freezing. The townspeople, noticing her absence at the parish hall, began filing their complaints on slips of paper pushed through her door. Some were urgent, most were not. A few included polite notes. Take your time. Hope your ink holds out. Thank you for remembering about the pig. She replied to most of them, some with full entries, others with just a simple check mark and the word noted. Then, one morning, she did not come to the desk. The shutters remained closed. The ink was left uncovered. The fire in the hearth had gone cold. Marjorie had passed in her sleep, wrapped in a shawl, with her book of odd and satisfying things resting gently beside her. The town clerk, newly appointed and somewhat younger, entered the building with great care. He did not move anything at first. He simply looked around, at the shelves, at the bundles, at the thousands of lines written by one hand over nearly 30 years, and at the ledger left open on the desk, mid-entry. It read, January 6th, year of our Lord 1401, frost holding, pig complaint resolved, window repair pending. That was the last thing she wrote. The townspeople gathered quietly that afternoon. There was no grand procession, just a few readings, a basket of barley rolls, and one man who spoke of how she had remembered exactly how much he owed for 3 years running, down to the farthing. They didn't build a statue. They did not rename a street, but they left her office intact. And for years afterward, if someone needed to know when a tax had been paid, or who had once claimed to own 2 pigs instead of 1, they would still say, "Look in Marjorie Sipp's records." She sit have written it down, and almost always she had. In the town of Rouen, along the northern bend of the Seine, there lived a man named Etienne Corbeil, who made teapots quietly, methodically, and without much innovation. This was sometime in the middle of the 17th century, though no one in the town could remember exactly when he started. The records were vague, and Etienne himself had no interest in anniversaries. He lived in a narrow house with blue shutters that had long since faded to gray, and he shared the building with no one. There was a cat once, but it wandered off after a loud thunderstorm and never returned. Etienne rose early, but never hurried. He kept a small kiln behind his house, just large enough for a dozen pieces at a time. The walls were dark with soot, and the air always smelled faintly of scorched clay and dried herbs. He didn't speak to many people. When he did, it was in short, factual sentences, mostly about temperature, moisture, or types of glaze. His teapots were simple, round, with small, curved handles and slightly uneven lids that never quite fit the same way twice. They were mostly gray or brown. Occasionally he experimented with green, though it always came out too pale. He never added decoration. When asked why, he simply said, "The water does not care." Each pot took 2 days to shape, 3 to dry, and another day to fire. He kept a notebook where he recorded temperatures, drying times, and minor imperfections, which he numbered but never explained. Entry 147 read, "Handle cracked mid-firing, possibly moon-related." He sold his pots once a week, under the same awning near the Rouen Market Square. He brought no signage, no prices, and rarely spoke to customers unless asked. His stall was set up between a cellar of brass weights and an elderly woman who made candles from sheep tallow. Both of them greeted Etienne with soft nods and little else. The townspeople didn't rush to buy his teapots. They simply assumed that if they needed one, he'd be there, and he always was. Most customers bought his work once, then never returned, not out of dissatisfaction, but because his pots rarely broke. They were slightly heavy, slightly tilted, and almost always poured a little too slowly, but they worked. He made lids that were too tight in the summer and too loose in the winter. He claimed this was not his fault. "Clay shrinks," he would say, "and weather is not my servant." Every evening, after the market closed, Etienne returned home, wiped his hands with a piece of cloth that was never quite clean, and sat in the corner of his small back room where he drank weak herbal tea made in one of his own imperfect pots. His shelves were full of unsold pots. Some were slightly chipped, others not quite symmetrical. He kept them all. "I know their moods," he once said. When visitors commented on the clutter, he would say, "They sit comfortable here." He rarely left Rouen. Once it said, he took a 2-day trip to Dieppe to look at a different kind of kiln. He came back unimpressed and made no changes to his own. When the weather was good, he left his door open. Neighbors walking by could see him gently turning clay in his hands, measuring nothing, adjusting only by feel. The air inside his workshop stayed cool, and the only sound most days was the soft squeak of his old wooden stool shifting slightly under his weight. Etienne kept no apprentices. A boy asked once, but Etienne said, "You'll want to make handles your own way, and I won't like it." That ended the matter. He never rushed a single step. If a pot cracked in drying, he broke it into pieces and scattered it in his garden, where fragments slowly disappeared into the soil. He called this clay returning to itself. He knew the precise moment when his kiln was ready, not by tools or timers, but by smell. Smells a bit like bread, but not bread you'd eat, he said once, and refused to explain further. As the years went by, Etienne's hands became more knotted, but he still shaped the clay. He worked a little slower, fired a little less, but never stopped entirely. And so, year after year, Etienne Corbeil made teapots no one talked about much. No one collected them. No one bragged about owning one. But whenever someone in Rouen poured tea from a pot that didn't drip, didn't wobble, and seemed to keep the warmth just right, they would say, "It's one of Etienne's." And that was all. The rains always came hardest in the late spring, when the Seine swelled just enough to soak the lower steps of the riverfront houses, and the square in Rouen turned to shallow puddles. Market days grew quieter during this season. Fewer stalls, fewer feet, fewer coins passed from hand to hand. For Etienne Corbeil, it made little difference. He brought the same small cart to the square every Wednesday. Whether the weather was fine or foul, the cart was made of ash wood, with one stubborn wheel that squeaked when turning left. He refused to oil it. "It keeps time," he once told the candle woman, who had stopped asking questions long ago. On rainy days, he brought fewer pots, 3, sometimes 4. He stacked them carefully, using folded wool scraps to separate the layers. The wool had once been a blanket. Now it smelled faintly of ash and sage. The smell didn't seem to bother the customers, though most passed him by entirely when it rained. Still, he waited. Under his small canvas canopy, he stood in his usual spot, arms crossed behind his back, watching the water gather in the cobblestones. He did not call out to passers-by. He did not wave or gesture. He simply stood. One drizzly Wednesday, a baker's wife approached and asked if he had anything rounder than usual. Etienne considered the request. Then, without a word, he reached into the back of his cart and produced a pot he'd made 3 winters earlier. It had been too round to stack neatly, and he had kept it on his shelf since then. The woman looked it over, nodded once, and handed him 2 coins. No bargaining, no small talk, just the quiet clink of metal and the sound of rain dripping steadily off the canopy edge. Etienne did not smile, but he did seem slightly more upright for a few minutes afterward. At home, the slow season gave him time to sort the shelves. He rearranged the unsold pots by glaze hue, gray near gray, brown near brown. The green ones, though few, had their own spot near the window where the light made them seem less pale. He labeled nothing. He also used this time to patch the kiln wall, which had begun to flake slightly from age. He mixed new clay with fine gravel and pressed it in with the flat edge of an old spoon. The patch didn't match the rest of the wall, but he didn't mind. "Kilns are like knees," he said once. "They wear in their own way." Tea, during this time, was made from dried mint or crushed fennel seed, steeped slowly in chipped pots that never left the shelf. He drank alone, facing the hearth, always with both hands on the teacup, even in warm weather. Rain crept into everything. The lintels, the corners of shelves, the folded wool. Etienne didn't bother sealing the cracks. "Moisture teaches patience," he wrote in his notebook under entry 219, which was otherwise blank. Now and then, a local would commission a teapot as a wedding gift or house present. These requests were always polite, always uncertain. People weren't sure if Etienne took commissions. He did, but he treated them no differently than the others. No special glaze, no extra polish, just the same slow turn of the wheel, the same steady hands. Sometimes, a customer would ask for a teapot, like the one you made for my cousin. Etienne would ask, "Which cousin?" And the customer would falter. He remembered the pots, not the buyers. By the time the rain let up, Etienne had reshaped 24 lids, refired 4 cracked bases, and added 11 new entries to his notebook. The entries included phrases like tilt acceptable, glaze reluctant but present, handle shaped itself. The slow season, he believed, was the best for making. There was no pressure to sell, no pressure to explain, just the quiet rhythm of clay and time. Neighbors sometimes invited him for soup or roasted chestnuts. He declined politely. He preferred meals at home, small, repetitive, often involving boiled lentils and dry bread. He never commented on the weather, but he kept a sliver of soapstone near the window. When the air felt heavy, he held it. "It tells me enough," he once said. As the skies brightened and the river calmed, the market square began to hum again. More stalls opened, more baskets passed hands, more pigeons gathered. Etienne returned to his usual full cart, 8 pots stacked carefully, wool in between. The squeaky wheel still turned left too sharply. The canopy still sagged in one corner. The pots still sold slowly, and he was content with that. By the time Etienne reached his 70s, though no one knew the exact number, including Etienne himself, he had made well over 1,000 teapots. He had never kept a full count. Numbers weren't what he followed. Instead, he remembered them by feel, by the shape of their spouts, the weight in his hands, or the way the lid had once clicked into place just so. He could not tell you which year he'd made his first pot, but he could describe the one with the lopsided base that never tipped, even when pushed. He fired less often now. The kiln took longer to heat. His legs took longer to carry him to the woodpile. Some days he would light it just to sit beside it, watching the smoke curl up and drift through the broken vent in the ceiling. He found it calming. His hands were still steady, but slower. His shoulders ached after long hours at the wheel, but he didn't complain. He simply stood up more often, walked in a slow loop around his workroom, and then sat again. The town of Rouen had changed in small, unhurried ways. The streets had been widened slightly. A few new houses had gone up with painted shutters. A traveling merchant came through now and then selling porcelain from the east, delicate, white, impossibly thin. People admired them. but most still used Etienne's pots at home. He never spoke ill of the porcelain. He only said, "They sift fine if you want the tea to cool too fast." One morning, when the air smelled faintly of peat smoke and new grass, Etienne prepared what he knew would be his final batch of pots. Not because of any particular feeling, just a quiet certainty, the way one knows when the rain will stop. He shaped 6 pots, all similar in form, with handles a little higher than usual. He used a glaze made from ground limestone and rainwater collected in an old basin that had cracked long ago but still held enough for his work. He fired them slowly, over 2 days. One cracked. He buried it near the edge of his garden. The other 5 he lined up neatly on his shelf. He didn't label them, didn't sign them. He simply sat with them for a while, sipping tea from the pot he'd made 20 years before, the one with the small chip in the spout that gave it a soft, irregular pour. He made no announcement. He stopped going to market. He let the cart gather dust under its canvas. One neighbor noticed. A baker's boy came by, asked if Etienne was still selling. Etienne replied, "The kiln sleeps now." The boy didn't understand, but he nodded and left a small loaf anyway. Etienne broke it in half and fed the pieces to the birds. He spent more time near the window, watching, not thinking, sometimes touching the pots on his shelf, like one might greet old friends who have said everything they need to say. When Etienne passed, it was during a mild spring night. The shutters were slightly open. A teacup sat cooling on the table, untouched. The kiln was dark. The town did not hold a grand memorial. That would have embarrassed him. Instead, they simply noticed the absence. The market felt slightly emptier. The sound of the squeaky cart wheel was missed by some, though they couldn't say why. His house remained untouched for a time. Eventually, a cousin Sip's son came and found the workshop, still arranged, as if waiting for Etienne to return from a short walk. He found the notebook, filled with quiet entries and strange, precise phrases. "Handle found its shape before I asked. Steam line pleasant. Cup survived the fall. Good omen." The cousin's son didn't know what to do with the pots, so he gave them away. One to the baker's wife, one to the candle maker, one to the man who used to sell brass weights. The rest stayed on the shelves until they too were quietly claimed. None were perfect, but they all poured steadily. Years later, if someone in ruin served tea in a slightly heavy pot with a lid that clicked just a little off-center, they would say, without fuss or ceremony, "That sip's one of Etienne's sips." And then they would pour the tea, slowly, carefully, just the way he would Sev wanted. In the hill country of southern Bavaria, where the roads twist more out of habit than necessity, there once lived a postman named Lucas Grunwald, who spent 35 years delivering letters, most of which arrived exactly 1 day later than expected. Lucas walked a circular route that wound through 6 villages, 3 hamlets, and 1 abandoned sawmill. The path was roughly 21 kilometers long, but he never measured it. He simply knew where his feet needed to go and which trees he'd pass along the way. There was the crooked larch near Obergarten that creaked like a loose stair, the mossy stump outside the Schneider farm that gathered rainwater perfectly in its hollow, and the narrow stone bridge where his boot once slipped during a frost and left a scuff he checked for every winter after. He carried a brown canvas satchel that had once been olive green, with buckles that clinked gently as he walked. The bag sagged to the left, just like his shoulder. Inside were letters, parcels, and the occasional folded newspaper wrapped in twine. He kept the heavier items near the bottom and sorted everything else by weight and familiarity. Lucas never opened the letters, but he came to recognize the feel of certain senders, paper that crinkled a particular way, or ink that bled faintly through the envelope. Every morning, he rose just after first light, drank a weak brew of barley coffee, and checked the sky. He did this not for weather prediction, but to confirm that the sky was still where it should be. If it was cloudy, he brought the thicker socks. If it was clear, he still brought the thicker socks, just in case. His house, a narrow wooden frame set against the base of a hill, smelled of wool, dried mushrooms, and something earthy that never quite left the floorboards. He shared it with no one, though now and then a neighbor's cat would stop by to sleep under the bench. Lucas called it the temporary tenant and never asked its name. Before leaving, he consulted a worn paper map pinned to his wall. It showed all the towns along his route, outlined in pale red ink, with numbers he had penciled in decades earlier. He didn't need the map anymore, but he liked the ritual of looking at it. His boots, made of dark leather with thick soles and stubborn laces, were resold every 3 winters by a cobbler in Hirschenfeld. They had no special markings, but Lucas knew exactly where they had worn thin. He walked in a way that avoided aggravating those spots. He did not whistle, he did not hum, but he walked with a rhythm, 3 slow steps, one slightly quicker. It came from an old injury in his right leg that had healed imperfectly. The rhythm gave his walk a kind of steady beat, like a ticking clock padded in felt. Villagers along the route expected him, but not precisely. He might arrive in the morning or just after lunch. If he was late, they assumed he'd pause to rest beneath the leaning pine by the road to Coltonbrunn, or taken the longer path past the pasture, where the sheep sometimes blocked his way without meaning to. He never scolded the sheep. He simply waited, hands behind his back, as if observing a moment of silence. The letters he delivered were rarely urgent, invitations to baptisms that had already occurred, notices from the city council, recipes, condolences, a son's short update from military training, written in cramped script with little punctuation, a yearly letter from a cousin in Stuttgart, always containing the same complaint about trains. Lucas read none of it, but he carried it all with equal care. At the end of each round, he returned home with a lighter bag and slightly damp socks. He hung them near the stove, filled a shallow basin with warm water, and soaked his feet while looking again at the map. Not because it had changed, but because it hadn't. He marked nothing. He kept no log. The memory of each delivery lived somewhere behind his eyes, settled like silt. And so, for more than 3 decades, Lucas Grunwald walked the same route, in roughly the same order, wearing roughly the same boots. He did not rush. He did not skip days. And he never, not once, misplaced a letter. He simply walked through fog, wind, light snow, and those bright, almost uncomfortable spring days when everything smelled too alive. His neighbor said you could set your clock by him. though they never agreed which clock. He did not mind. Spring in the Bavarian hills was less an event and more a gradual loosening. The ice on the stone troughs began to crack, one slow line at a time. Roofs that had groaned under snow began to drip, and footpaths reappeared from beneath packed mud and old straw. And for Lucas Grunwald, it meant one thing above all: damp letters. Each year, as surely as the wood stove grew less necessary, the mail grew softer. The dampness wasn't ruinous, just enough to warp a corner, to blur the lower half of an address, to make a folded page seem like it had been breathed on. Lucas adjusted accordingly. He wrapped the letters in waxed cloth, one of which had belonged to his uncle and smelled permanently of linseed oil. He rotated the letters in his bag more often, nudging the edges apart to let air flow through, and he carried a small square of beeswax cloth to blot anything that had gone too limp. He never complained. He simply took more time sorting in the mornings and walked with extra care around puddles. The crooked wooden posts outside most village houses, where mail was sometimes left if no one answered, were another spring ritual. With the ground soft from thaw, many of the posts leaned ever so slightly by April. Some leaned forward, some to the side, a few in defiance of basic geometry. Lucas never tried to straighten them. He simply adjusted his reach, placed the letters at an angle, and occasionally left a smooth stone atop them to keep them from fluttering off in the wind. He made a note of particularly unreliable posts. At the Schulze farm, the box had been missing its lid for 7 years. At the inn in Dorflingen, a chicken occasionally nested near the letter slot. Lucas had once been pecked. Not hard, but he now carried a dry crust of bread to distract the bird, which he called Frau Hen, though she likely had another name. One morning, on the road between Kaltenbrunn and Miesenfeld, Lucas paused near a familiar birch tree and unfolded a small letter addressed to Frau Elsbeth Wernig, second house, past the stone well, with the green shutters, mostly. The note inside, he imagined, was probably from her cousin, who always added too much description to her addresses. But the envelope was damp, the ink slightly runny, and Lucas waited until he reached the shade to hand it over personally, rather than leave it in her crooked box where it might dissolve altogether. Elsbeth accepted the letter with her usual nod and handed Lucas a warm bun wrapped in cloth. He did not thank her. He never thanked people for the bread they gave, but he did place it carefully atop the remaining stack so it wouldn't squash the parcels below. He would eat it later, sitting on the flat stone beside the goat path, where the moss always dried first. In the evenings, Lucas kept a small fire going just high enough to dry his socks and soften the chill from the corners of the room. His stove was old and let out 3 kinds of creaks, one for warmth, one for uneven wood, and one, he believed, for company. He used this quiet time to dry his letters, if needed, by standing them near the edge of the stovetop, rotating them slightly, never too close. He once scorched the edge of a bill of sale and had felt vaguely unsettled about it for a week. As the weeks passed, the snow vanished from the north slopes, and the air took on the smell of bark and distant plowing. Lucas adjusted his route slightly to avoid the muddiest stretch near the riverbank, where once his boot had sunk deep enough to pull off the sole. He didn't mind the change. The road wanders. I follow, he once told a boy who asked if he ever got lost. He never did. Not really. He might have taken a wrong turn once in 1871, but it had led him past a cherry tree in bloom, and he'd decided it wasn't wrong after all. That spring, the letters kept coming. The cousin in Stuttgart continued to write, still unimpressed with trains. A child sent a drawing to a grandmother with no envelope. Lucas folded it gently and carried it under his scarf to keep it from creasing. And day after day, week after week, Lucas delivered the damp, soft mail of early spring with quiet steadiness, accepting buns, dodging chickens, and marking the progress of thaw, not in temperatures, but in the way paper bent in his fingers. He would finish his route, return home, hang his socks to dry, and sit by the map he never needed, looking at the hills he already knew. The kettle would whistle faintly, once, then fade. The fire would crack, just enough to remind him it was still burning. And the next morning, he would set out again. In the summer of 1895, the hedges grew taller than usual along the path between Lindholz and Obergarten. The rain had been generous that spring, and everything bloomed as though trying to make up for previous seasons. Even the moss on the footbridges seemed more plush than before. Lucas Grunwald noticed, of course, but he didn't remark on it. He simply shifted his route slightly to avoid the overgrowth and adjusted the tilt of his cap to keep the hanging branches from brushing his forehead. That summer, his satchel was lighter than it had been in years. Several households had moved away, drawn to the cities by factory work, faster trains, or relatives who claimed life was more modern elsewhere. Lucas didn't question their absence. He simply skipped the stops where the posts now stood empty and the shutters stayed closed. One morning in early July, as the mist lingered a little longer than usual over the stream near Wiesenbruck, Lucas found a letter in his bag that he did not recognize. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat but uncertain, as though the writer had paused often. There was no return address, no recipient-sit's name, just a simple note written across the front in faded graphite for whoever should receive it. Lucas turned the letter over twice. The seal was already broken. He did not open it. He never opened letters, but he did pause. He stood beneath the bent alder tree near the edge of the meadow, holding the letter in his hands, feeling the slight unevenness of its fold. Then, without hesitation, he slipped it into the side pocket of his satchel, where he kept oddments twine, a stub of pencil, an old brass button, and a stone shaped like an egg. He delivered the rest of the day's mail, stopped to refill his flask at the spring behind the blacksmith's house, and returned home just as the clouds began to gather in the east. Rain fell during the night, soft and steady, pattering against the shutters like slow applause. The next morning, Lucas awoke a little later than usual. He sat for a while by the window, the letter still untouched in his side pocket. He drank his barley coffee, ate a slice of rye bread with no butter, and put on his boots. But he did not leave. That day, for the first time in 35 years, the route went unwalked. No one raised alarm. The letters weren't urgent. Most households assumed he was ill, or simply delayed by a swollen creek. The day after, there was still no sign of Lucas. A neighbor finally checked his home and found the stove warm, the boots by the door, and the satchel on the table neatly packed. Inside were 5 undelivered letters, all correctly sorted, and in the side pocket, folded once and lightly creased, was the letter with no name. No one opened it. It was placed with his other belongings, kept respectfully, but unread. The villagers, unsure what else to do, organized a small farewell a week later. There was no sermon, only quiet conversation, and a short walk along the first part of Lucas's road. Someone placed a smooth stone on the leaning post outside the Wernig house. Another left a sprig of sage on the bench near the goat path. The mail was handled by someone else after that, a younger man, quick of step, who carried a pocket watch and tried to reorganize the route to improve efficiency. People said he was polite enough, but he delivered everything too quickly. "He doesn't pause under the larch," someone remarked. "And he steps over the moss by the pasture," said another. No one mentioned Lucas often, but every so often, when a letter arrived a day later than expected, or a bun was left on a doorstep without explanation, someone would say quietly, just like before, "The alder tree still leans near Wiesenbrook." The map in Lucas's house, though faded, remains pinned to the wall, and somewhere in a wooden drawer, wrapped in beeswax cloth, sits the letter with no name, still sealed, still waiting. In the village of Little Brackenbury, which sat modestly between a muddy brook and a well-meaning hedge maze, lived a man named Oswald Peabody, who for 28 consecutive years measured the rain, not in passing, not idly, but fully, with unwavering dedication, 3 times a day, every day, from the spring of 1803 until the winter of 1831. Oswald Peabody lived alone in a narrow brick house with one working fireplace and 17 ceramic frogs scattered throughout his garden. The frogs were not decorative. They were placed, Oswald once explained to no one in particular, to help him sense moisture in the soil through observation, not interference. He wore brown coats in every season, each with a slightly different number of pockets, one for the day's rainfall notebook, one for a pencil stub, and several others whose contents changed with the weather. In late summer, for instance, he often carried a single dried bean, for comparison, though it was never made clear what it was being compared to. The most important fixture in Mr. Peabody's life, however, was a hand-fashioned rain gauge made from a glass funnel, a brass-rimmed measuring cylinder, and a base constructed from an upturned jam pot, stabilized with pebbles and 3 flat marbles. He cleaned it every Sunday with distilled water and dried it with a cloth that was, by his own admission, less absorbent than desired, but consistent in its behavior. Every morning at precisely 6 o'clock, Oswald would shuffle out to the back garden, notebook already open, and peer into the gauge. If it had rained, he measured the amount precisely. If it hadn't sit, he recorded none, sometimes adding the note "sky drowsy." He took a second reading at noon and a third just before dusk, whether it was raining or not. In his view, consistency was more valuable than novelty. His notebooks, bound in dull green cloth and labeled Precipitation, Year X, filled 3 shelves in his study, stacked in strict chronological order. Each page contained careful entries, numbers, small sketches of clouds, and occasional annotations like dampness perceptible in trousers, or frog 5 left of lilac, submerged past ankle. No one in Little Brackenbury had asked him to do this. There was no scientific institution awaiting his findings, but people accepted his work the way they accepted chimney smoke in winter, or the slow tolling of the parish bell. It was simply what Oswald Peabody did. He rarely spoke of anything else. If asked how he was, he might reply with, "Humidity appears to be descending or barometer holding, but suspicious." His neighbors found this comforting. Children were fond of him in a respectful, cautious way. He once explained dew formation to 3 of them using a biscuit tin, a teaspoon, and a wet handkerchief. They didn't follow it, but they remembered it. He grew no vegetables, but tended his garden with intense care. He pruned with weather in mind, adjusted the placement of stones to observe drainage, and occasionally moved the ceramic frogs. No two were ever in the same spot twice within a fortnight. Oswald Sipp's meals were regular and unvarying: porridge in the morning, broth at noon, bread and apple slices in the evening. He believed digestion worked best under routine, and that unpredictability in diet could interfere with barometric interpretation. He had once tried to grow cucumbers, but found their shape distractingly assertive. His home smelled faintly of chalk, dried mint, and wool. The floor creaked in predictable places, and the fire crackled more in humid conditions, which he noted in his evening records. He wore slippers indoors and never went upstairs after sundown. Visitors were rare. When they did arrive, he offered weak tea and a choice of 3 topics: cloud height estimation, soil saturation gradients, or historical rainfall during coronations. Most chose the third. Each evening, after his final measurement, he sat in his high-backed chair by the hearth and copied his entries into a larger master log, a ledger with fine ruled lines and headings inked in precise copperplate script. He did this even if nothing had fallen from the sky that day. "There is dignity in the absence of rain," he once told the baker's wife, who had nodded slowly and left him a small rye loaf as thanks. And so, day after day, year after year, Oswald Peabody watched the skies, measured what they gave, and wrote it all down. He made no predictions. He sought no patterns. He simply observed. And in Little Brackenbury, when it rained, as it often did, someone would inevitably say, "Peabody Settle be out with his jar." And indeed, he was. By the 12th year of Oswald Peabody's rainkeeping, the townspeople had begun referring to certain years not by events or harvests, but by rainfall totals. "Remember the 8-inch April of Sip 09? They Sid say? Or back when Peabody Sip's funnel overflowed? Must Sip been the long soak of Sip 17? Oswald, of course, never used such informal phrasing. In his logs, the events were listed precisely as April 3rd, 27, 1809, accumulated total 8.03 inches, moisture persistent, occasional east wind, garden visibility moderate, October 1st, 14, 1817, gauge surpassed full measure twice. Notes indicate overflow managed by saucer method. The saucer method involved placing a shallow dish beside the gauge and transferring excess rain into it with a small tin spoon. The process took time but, Oswald noted, preserves numerical integrity. He used this method 7 times in 28 years. Each occasion earned a star in the margin of his records. Not for importance, he simply liked the way the stars looked on the page. Each October brought a renewed sense of purpose. Autumn rain, he believed, was more emotionally consistent than the fickle showers of spring or the showy deluge of summer. October rains tended to arrive quietly, linger politely, and leave the earth properly saturated. He especially liked the sound of light rain on slate, like a slow conversation. He once said to the vicar, who had stopped by to return a borrowed pamphlet about evaporation. The vicar said nothing, but took to listening more closely during wet afternoons. During the second decade of his measurements, Oswald experimented briefly with dew collection. He used a strip of linen suspended on a wire frame and recorded how damp it became before sunrise. He abandoned the practice after 3 seasons, finding the data temperamentally uncooperative and the linen difficult to dry evenly indoors. His main focus remained rain, and his methods remained consistent. He still measured 3 times a day, still used the same notebook format, still used the same brass-rimmed cylinder, though he had replaced the funnel once after it developed a chip on the lip. He filed the broken funnel under his bed in a labeled box marked "Retired Instruments," not to be forgotten. When neighbors asked how the rain had been, Oswald never answered in generalities. He would say, "A shade over half an inch since Sunday," though the overnight reading was slightly marred by bird interference. Bird interference was a known problem. One particular starling had taken to perching on the rim of the funnel, occasionally relieving itself into the gauge. Oswald adjusted for this in his readings, subtracting 0.02 inches and noting avian contamination. He considered installing a wire guard, but ultimately chose not to. "Nature participates," he wrote. The townspeople did not read his logs, but they trusted them. When there was a flood in 1813, Oswald's measurements helped the miller plan his repairs. When the church roof needed rethatching, his decade of records helped choose the driest week. And yet, Oswald remained almost entirely solitary. He preferred quiet routines. Breakfast was always at 7:10, toast with no butter. He considered butter weather-dependent and therefore unreliable. He wore his second-best waistcoat on Wednesdays, as it had deeper pockets for notes. He trimmed his hedges with a small, stiff brush rather than shears, to avoid startling the robins. Every evening, before the final entry of the day, he would sit with a single candle lit on his desk and reread the morning's notes aloud to himself in a steady whisper. This was not for editing purposes. He simply liked the sound of weather being spoken plainly. In the autumn of 1823, a brief period of consecutive drizzle, 11 days with no sun, caused some worry among villagers. People muttered about poor drainage, spoiled apples, and general malaise. Oswald remained calm. His notes from that fortnight include: Day 4, rain gentle, no wind, spirits level. Day 9, rain continues. Slight increase in slipperiness of outer steps. Observed worm migration. Day 11, rain lighter, almost diffident. Expect change within 3 days. The rain stopped 2 days later. His ability to write about the sky without ever trying to change it was what made his work oddly comforting. He offered no forecasts, no judgments, just the details, quietly and without flourish. And so every October, villagers looked to the sky and said things like, "Feels like one of Peabody's Octobers," or "I wonder what he's writing today." They never asked to read it. It was enough to know he was recording it. Because in Little Brackenbury, the rain did not go unnoticed. It went into the books. By the spring of 1831, Oswald Peabody had filled 27.5 notebooks with rainfall measurements, barometric remarks, and small, consistent observations about the garden soil, cloud texture, and slipperiness of boots. The 28th notebook was nearly identical in appearance to the others: green cloth, spine hand-labeled in India ink, pages ruled with faint blue lines. But the entries inside would be markedly different, not for lack of effort, but for lack of rain. That year, Little Brackenbury experienced what Oswald came to call the slow drought, not a dramatic, crop-destroying dry spell, but a long, steady absence. There were no cracks in the earth, no desperate prayers in the church, just empty skies and empty gauges. He recorded it without sentiment. April 2nd. No measurable rain. Garden soil firm, but compliant. Bird activity, moderate. April 11th. Still none. Funnel polished. Visibility perfect. Slight personal creakiness in knees. April 21st. None. Frog hash 4 relocated voluntarily to shade. Each entry during that long spring was followed by a measured pause. Sometimes he added nothing more than a line or two. Other times he filled the page with comparisons: how the air felt against the side of the house, the way his boots no longer collected mud near the lilac bush, or the sharpness of bird shadows in the morning light. People began to ask after him more frequently during this dry stretch, not out of concern. He remained perfectly punctual and continued his 3 daily checks, but out of a quiet hope that he might declare an end to it. He never did. "It will rain when it chooses," he said, more than once, and not a moment before. His voice remained soft, his movements steady, but he began to lean more heavily on the fence post near the garden gate, and took longer to write out his master log in the evenings. The candle he used burned lower, and he occasionally paused mid-sentence to watch the wick flicker before continuing. In May, he received a letter from a weather enthusiast in Kent, who had somehow acquired one of Oswald's early notebooks through a cousin. The letter was brief and admiring, asking about his methods. Oswald considered replying, then instead copied the letter, annotated it in the margins, and filed it between years 1806 and 1807. "May as well live in the archive," he wrote beneath it. As summer approached, the rain remained absent. The frogs stayed low in the grass. The ceramic ones gathered more dust than usual. Oswald washed them with a damp cloth on Sundays, a small routine not mentioned in any notebook. One morning in mid-June, he did not go out to the gauge at 6. It was the first time since April 1803. A neighbor, noticing his absence, stopped by and found the door unlatched, the stove cold, and the notebooks neatly stacked in their usual place. The 28th notebook lay open on the desk, pen resting gently across the final entry. June 14. No rain. Gauge dry. Air unmoved. All still. Oswald had passed in the night, without fuss or notice. His slippers were beside the chair. The kettle had not boiled. A folded cloth sat on the windowsill, still slightly damp from polishing the brass cylinder. There was no funeral in the usual sense. A few neighbors gathered and recounted their favorite phrases from his logs. Someone brought a small funnel, which was set beside the church altar for a week in quiet tribute. It collected no rain. His notebooks were eventually passed to a school teacher in Norwich, who read them aloud to students during indoor days. Most of the children found them dull. A few found them comforting. One boy began sketching clouds and taping the drawings to his windowsill. The garden returned to its usual state within a season. The frogs, real and ceramic, remained in their places. The rain eventually returned in late July, steady and unremarkable. The new gauge, placed there by a curious neighbor, recorded the first measurable rain of the summer. 0.9 inches. Soft beginning. No wind. There was no one left to log it properly. But the village still remembered. And once, years later, when an unusually long dry spell visited again, someone in the bakery remarked, "It sets another Peabody year." And then they went back to slicing bread. In the coastal town of Penhale, perched on a gentle rise just above the salt marshes, there once stood an inn called the Lamb and Hearth. It was built of stone with a sloped slate roof that dripped steadily in rain and ticked softly when the sun returned. From 1728 until 1752, it was run by a man named Reginald Voss, who made no claim to fame except this: he wrote down the breakfast of every single guest who stayed in his inn for 24 years. Not just the general meal, the specific plate, the hour, whether the egg yolk had broken, if the bread had been lightly burnt or evenly browned. He noted whether the guest spoke during the meal or ate in silence, whether tea was refilled, if butter was declined. The ledgers still exist, 7 thick volumes bound in cracked leather, pages yellowing and faintly fragrant with salt, wood smoke, and over 100 entries about stewed apples. Reginald Voss himself was neither especially tall nor especially short. His voice was low and slightly gravelly, a result of years spent calling orders over the clatter of iron pans and the hiss of hearth coals. He wore the same wool vest every day except washing day, and he buttoned it from bottom to top, always pausing on the third button from the top, which stuck slightly but eventually yielded. He was not an ambitious man, nor was he particularly sociable, but he believed firmly in breakfast. Not as a meal, but as a mirror. People show who they are in how they start the day, he once said to a merchant from Devon who had arrived with a wet cloak and left with 2 jars of marmalade. He ran the inn with slow precision. The front door opened at 6, fire lit by 6:15, tea water drawn and boiled by 1/2 past, bread sliced evenly, bacon laid out in sets of 2, no more, no less, oats stirred in one direction only, and never with the pewter spoon which he believed altered the taste. Each guest, upon arrival, was asked only 3 questions. Would they be staying the night? Did they prefer tea or barley coffee? Were they inclined towards sweet, savory, or undecided in the morning? Their answers were noted on a folded slip of parchment and later transferred neatly with blotting into the breakfast ledger under the day's date. He kept a separate book for room assignments, but far less detail went into it. Sometimes just a name, a town, and the words "quiet sleeper" or "stairs creak" under him. The guests who stayed at the Lamb and Hearth were not noble or notorious. They were millers, fishmongers, surveyors, midwives, the occasional letter carrier or lost cartwright. Reginald treated them all with equal neutrality. He did not smile unless it was absolutely appropriate, and even then only in half measure. But he remembered things. He remembered that Mr. Halbert from Truro could not eat salted butter on Thursdays, that Miss Finch, who stayed for 4 nights in spring, stirred her tea exactly 4 times before drinking, that the apprentice roofer from Redruth once slept through breakfast entirely and left a small apology note folded inside a clean handkerchief. The entries in the breakfast ledger reflect all of this and more. They are calm, unhurried, and deeply mundane. March 3rd. Mr. Wilkins. Room 2. Haddock. Weak tea. 1 slice bread. Lightly toasted. Declined butter. Looked out window most of meal. May 14th. Eliza and Mary, sisters, shared porridge. 1 added honey. 1 declined. Tea refilled once. Discussed shoe repair. August 9th. Unknown name. Travel stained. Fried egg. Yolk firm. Did not speak. Paid in coin and left before second bell. Reginald wrote these not as judgment, nor as gossip, but as record. A man who ate jam before butter was simply a man who ate jam before butter. No further conclusion needed. He did not expect anyone to read the ledgers, but he kept them with the same care as he did the cooking pots, wiping them down every Sunday and storing them in a cupboard near the chimney, where the wood stayed dry even in winter. Guests rarely stayed long. A night, 2, sometimes 3, if the weather turned or the roads were thick with sheep. But Reginald welcomed them with a warm hearth, a dry floor, and a breakfast precisely suited to their earlier answer. The inn itself creaked in a comforting way. The floorboards in the upstairs hallway bent slightly near the third door. The shutters had been mended with twine and shellac. The tap water was drawn from a well with a slightly metallic taste, which Reginald neutralized by boiling it twice. Everything about the place was slightly uneven, slightly damp, and utterly reliable, and that was just how he liked it. In the ledger for the year 1739, sometime between a brief entry about a butter merchant with an uneven gait and a group of flax traders who all ordered the same breakfast without speaking, there is a curious line. April 18th. Mrs. C. returned after 3 years, requested porridge with nutmeg, sat in silence, left a sprig of thyme on the window latch. It is the only time a guest is referred to with a single initial. Reginald remembered her at once. She had first stayed in room 4, back in the spring of 1736. Her handwriting on the sign-in slip had been steady, her cloak worn at the cuffs, her boots neither polished nor scuffed. She had ordered porridge, plain each morning, ate slowly, and asked only once whether nutmeg was available. At the time it was not, but Reginald had remembered, and 3 years later, when she appeared again with no explanation and even fewer words, he had the nutmeg ready, ground fresh that morning, just a pinch stirred and carefully at the end of cooking, so the steam carried it gently toward the nose. She did not compliment the flavor. She simply ate, and Reginald, true to form, recorded the event in the ledger with no embellishment. Just the facts, the date, the dish, and the sprig of thyme she left behind, neither explained nor taken back. He pressed that time between 2 pages of the ledger, not sentimentally. He simply thought it might dry evenly there. The rest of that year continued as it had the others. The breakfasts repeated themselves in endless combinations: soft boiled eggs, dry toast, stewed apples, a single sausage, weak tea, cold ham. The variations were small, but Reginald recorded each one with the same steady hand. Sometimes he added a note when something interrupted the usual flow. July 22nd. Bread burnt. My error. Guest did not object. May have been distracted. October 3rd. Rain so loud. Guest spoke more quietly than usual. Porridge thinned slightly. No complaints. November 11th. Egg undercooked. Corrected and replaced. Guest apologized. I accepted. When guests remarked on his attention to detail, Reginald nodded and changed the subject. He believed small things deserved full notice, but not full conversation. The village had grown used to him. Children passed the inn with quiet interest, watching for his twice daily trips to the well or his precise placement of chairs by the hearth. He rarely left town, and never without preparing the next morning's breakfast notes in advance. Every Friday, he reread a random page from one of the ledgers. Not for editing, he never altered a single entry, but as a kind of comfort. Familiar names, familiar meals, a kind of rhythm that outlasted weather, politics, and the churn of the outside world. In the spring of 1744, a group of government surveyors stayed for 5 nights while measuring the coastline. Reginald recorded each of their breakfasts with great care. March 16th, Surveyor 1, kippers, egg soft, tea with sugar. Surveyor 2, stewed plums, bread declined tea. Surveyor 3, cold meat, 2 slices, 8 standing up. March 17th, same meals. Surveyor 2 added tea. Surveyor 3 again stood. March 18th, all took porridge. Surveyor 1 added honey. Group silent until leaving. After they departed, Reginald took an extra moment to sweep their rooms. Not because they were messy, they were quite tidy, but because the rhythm had shifted slightly. He adjusted the chairs back to their usual angle, straightened the hooks by the door, and resumed his routine. The ledgers continued to fill. Sometimes entries were unusually brief. June 8th. Guest refused breakfast. Said he had already eaten. Left at dawn. Wore a green scarf. Other times they were oddly long. September 12th. Miss Linton, returning from Bristol. Porridge with cinnamon. Tea refilled 3 times. Asked about the firewood. Said nothing else. Stayed until bell. But always they followed the same quiet form. No opinion, no embellishment, just the record. In ink that darkened over the years with the slow humidity of Cornwall. As time passed, Reginald's handwriting grew slightly smaller, his fingers slower to warm in the morning chill. He lit the fire earlier, stirred the oats more slowly, but he never missed an entry. And in the ledger for 1748, there is this note. October 27th. Mrs. C again. Same room, same porridge. No nutmeg this time. Asked nothing. Left before light. Reginald added a final line. Sprig of thyme not replaced. And that was all. By 1751, the lamp and hearth had begun to lean, ever so slightly, toward the east. A mason who passed through noticed the shift in the corner beams, but said nothing. The windows fogged more easily. The floor near room 3 creaked in a different tone. Still, the inn remained solid where it counted. Warm, dry, and smelling faintly of toasted oats and coal ash. Reginald Voss, now moving more slowly, adjusted accordingly. He placed his kettle on the left side of the grate, where the flame burned steadier. He stacked the firewood 2 rows instead of 3. He wrote with a heavier pen to help steady his hand. And still without fail, he recorded every breakfast. In the margins of his final ledger, a few entries appear less neat. The ink sometimes wobbles, the spacing falters slightly, but the structure, the care, and the soft, unhurried precision remain. March 4th, Mr. Yates. Bacon overdone, my fault. Tea untouched, paid with coin, nodded once. March 11th, wind strong. Breakfast delayed 5 minutes due to fire. Guest accepted delay without mention. April 2nd, Mrs. Elling. Bread and jam. Asked after my hands. I said they were fine. No one in Penhale kept such records, nor did they know quite what to make of them. A few visitors took to peeking at the ledgers. Reginald allowed this, silently. One woman, reading her own entry from a year prior, said quietly, "I had forgotten that I took marmalade then." She took jam on her return visit and asked if he would note the change. He already had. By midsummer, fewer travelers passed through. A new road had opened farther inland, straighter and less prone to flooding. The foot traffic thinned. Weeks went by with only 1 or 2 guests. Reginald continued to rise at the same time. He lit the fire, boiled the water, measured the oats. He cleaned the tables, even when no one had sat at them. He sharpened his pencils every Sunday, whether they'd been used or not. He did not complain of his health, but began sitting a little longer near the hearth after breakfast was over. He sometimes reread older entries, tracing them slowly with his finger. His favorite seemed to be a note from 1733, May 9th. Guest unknown, left no name, ate porridge slowly, watching the fire, remarked it was set the quietest meal I said have had in years. On the morning of September 7th, 1752, no fire was lit in the Lamb and Hearth. A local boy, sent to collect kindling, found Reginald still seated in his chair, eyes closed, hands folded neatly atop the ledger. The entry from the day before had been completed in full. September 6th, Mr. Bell. 2 eggs, lightly fried, toasted bread, tea refilled twice, thanked me. Weather mild. No page followed. The townspeople held a quiet gathering. There was no sermon. Someone brought the final ledger and read the entries aloud for a while until the room smelled of memory and dry ink. No one wept. Instead, they placed small objects on the mantel, an old teacup, a wooden spoon, a folded napkin. The inn closed not long after. The ledgers were kept in a linen-wrapped box and placed in the care of the local clerk, who stored them in the parish records room. For years afterward, travelers who passed through the village would occasionally ask, "Is that the place with the breakfast man?" And someone would always nod and say, "Yes." He wrote everything down. Eventually, the roof fell in. The east wall crumbled, but the smell of toast, faint as it was, seemed to linger in the stone, and the breakfasts, page after page, remain quiet, exact, and gently forgotten. On the south coast of Devon, just where the cliffs dip and the sea grows quiet, lies a stretch of shore called Foxcombe Strand, not especially known for anything, not fishing, not smuggling, not bathing, but quite reliable when it came to pebbles. They weren't rare pebbles, nor dazzling, just plentiful, smoothed by tide and time, slate gray, chalk white, speckled flint, a few orange speckled bits of jasper that locals mostly stepped over without notice, except for the Fullerton brothers. From 1881 to 1899, the three Fullerton brothers, Alfred, Lionel, and Thomas, cataloged every pebble they collected from that beach, not just by color or shape, but by temperature on pickup, by estimated dryness, by texture scale, their own invention, ranging from 1 glassy to 5 crumbly, and by how many seconds it took to skip or sink when tossed into a still pool. They were not scientists. They were sons of a postmaster. They had no formal education past the village school, but they had time, 3 notebooks, and a strict rotation schedule. One brother cataloged, one selected, one observed. Alfred was the eldest and liked the largest stones. He had broad fingers and a gentle way of turning a rock over in his palm, like a baker inspecting dough. He wore a blue scarf in all weather and was known for saying, "This one's honest," as if referring to the pebble's moral character. Lionel, the middle brother, was the note-taker. His handwriting was upright, narrow, and consistent, columns of neat figures and brief, curiously formal remarks. March 2nd, 1884. Sample. Hash 219. Damp. Egg smooth. Palm fit. Slight mica sparkle. Skipped 2x, then sank. Observed by A. Thomas, the youngest, was the most precise. He handled the weighing, the tin boxes, and later the pinhole camera they used to document placement. He once measured a stone's circumference using a bootlace, then measured the lace against a ruler, which he suspected might not be entirely accurate. He noted this in red ink. Ruler suspected. Use cloth tape next time. Their method was steady. Arrive on the strand just after mid-morning. Choose a 12-foot stretch. Select pebbles no larger than a hen's egg, no smaller than a plum. Catalog up to 40 stones per outing. Clean, dry, and store each sample in its assigned tin. The tins were simple, round, with screw-top lids, once used for lozenges or shoe polish. Each had a small label, handwritten and varnished, bearing its sample number and date. They stored the tins in a 3-drawer cabinet in their shed behind the old stables. The drawers were lined with cotton to prevent clinking. They never sold a single stone, never displayed them. They didn't talk much about why they did it, but they agreed, from the beginning, to follow the method with reasonable seriousness, as Alfred put it, as if someone, someday, might want to know the difference between a March stone and a September one. They collected in all weathers. If it rained, they brought a waxed cloth to kneel on. If it was hot, they wore wide-brimmed hats and carried tepid tea in cork-stoppered jars. In winter, they warmed their fingers over a tin lantern and sometimes recorded a stone's warmth only after it had sat in a pocket for a few minutes. This, too, was noted. Visitors to the beach ignored them at first. A few curious dogs sniffed their boxes. Children occasionally asked, "Are you finding treasure?" To which Alfred once replied, "Only what was already here." They rarely kept stones with unusual colors. If a pebble had a strong band of red or a glint of metal, they passed it over. "Too ambitious," Lionel said once. "We prefer the reliable." And so, over nearly 2 decades, the brothers compiled what may have been the most consistent, completely unrequested pebble archive in southern England. They never argued about which stones to keep. If there was uncertainty, they simply moved on. "The beach will make more," Thomas would say. and that settled it. Their entries remained quiet, factual, and gently repetitive. Sample hash 404, dry, gray beige, not chalk, some grit to touch, no strong opinion when tapped. Sample hash 609, damp, slight sparkle, warmer than expected, felt familiar. Their notebooks filled, their tin cabinet filled, their pockets too always seemed to carry a stone or two under consideration. They told no one beyond the village. They did not publish their notes, though Lionel once wondered aloud if a museum might find the collection curious, if not useful. Nothing came of it. Still, they carried on, and each evening, after their outing, they'd sit in the shed, sipping tea that had cooled too much, and quietly sort the day's samples by type, by weight, and most importantly, by feel. Because to the Fullerton brothers, it wasn't about the rarity or the spectacle. It was about how a stone felt in the hand, and what the sea had made of it over time. By the late 1880s, the Fullerton brothers had developed a reliable rhythm that governed their weekly expeditions to Foxcombe Strand. Each Sunday afternoon, after a midday meal of broth and bread, they packed the pebble kit, a folded measuring cloth, a tin of numbered labels, 2 handkerchiefs for drying, Lionel's notebook, and most importantly, the skip stick, a thin piece of driftwood used to test pebbles for skipability. The skip test had rules. Alfred would select a candidate, rub it once with the cloth, then pass it to Thomas, who'd inspect it for symmetry. If it passed, he would hand it to Lionel, who stood by the tide pool and gently skimmed it across the stillest part of the water. Anything that skipped more than twice was labeled agile in the margin. Anything that sank outright was labeled deliberate. Stones that spun without skipping were noted as uncertain. Over the years, they developed a small code system for these descriptors. A pencil X for agile, a dot for deliberate, a small tilde for uncertain. Thomas once proposed a tiny checkmark for stones that looked faster than they were, but this was dismissed as speculative. Each evening after a collection day, they returned to the shed to record their findings. The shed smelled of salt and lamp oil, with a faint undertone of pencil shavings and wool. The drawers of tins had grown so full by 1890 that they'd begun adding a 4th drawer made from an old beekeeper's cabinet. Lionel lined it with a folded curtain to prevent rattle. Their days were peaceful and uneventful, but in July of 1891, an occurrence broke the routine, albeit gently. A visitor from Bath, Mr. Elwood Trent, arrived at the village to sketch coastal scenes. He was a quiet man with a checkered satchel and an interest in local peculiarities. On his 3rd day, he wandered to the beach and found the Fullerton brothers mid-catalog. He observed them for nearly 10 minutes before asking, "Are you collecting fossils?" Alfred replied, "No, just pebbles." "For art?" "No, for themselves." Mr. Trent asked permission to observe, which they granted with a slight nod. He stood beside them as they measured a speckled quartz the size of a walnut, noted its weight 37 grams, its feel Category 2, soft grit, and attempted a skip tilde. Mr. Trent did not ask to touch the stones, which pleased Thomas. "He respects the system," he later remarked. The visitor returned the next afternoon with a folded sheet of paper and presented it to Lionel. It was a sketch of the 3 brothers at work. Lionel writing, Alfred crouched, Thomas holding the cloth tape. They framed the drawing and pinned it inside the shed door, not prominently, just above the hook where they kept the spare tins. Sample hash 1178, chalky edge, very flat, through far, satisfying sound, not remarkable. A comment like that might seem dismissive to others, but they still recorded. Their final months of cataloging were slower, but just as thorough. More entries began to reflect memory rather than strict description. Sample hash 2251, likely chalk. Found near gate, dry. Reminds me of sample hash 188. Sample hash 2254 did not skip, kept anyway, felt companionable. 1 week later, Alfred passed in his sleep, in the same bed he slept in since he was 22. The drawer of tin hash 1003 was open beside him. It held a light slate pebble with a faint ridge across the center. Its label read, 2 weeks later, Lionel followed. His final words, recorded not in the notebook, but in Thomas Sepp's memory, were be sure to label the last ones properly. And then, quietly, the ledger ended. Evening observations from her own window, sketching in low light with a magnifier and wool blanket over her shoulders. She never married. She never moved. Her only regular visitor was the lamplighter's apprentice, who brought her spare tallow from the chapel once a month, always wrapped in muslin. She gave him apples in return. In the town ledger, Penelope Haskett was listed only once. Resident, edge of town, quiet habits. But in her own records, she appeared frequently. March 9th, 1823, my own window, 1 beeswax stub, burned low, observed 3 flickers, trimmed wick, flame held steady. One household puzzled her. House hash 18, a narrow brick building with an ivy-covered chimney, had shown no candlelight for 3 weeks running. This was unusual. It belonged to Mrs. Croom, a widow known to read late into the night and boil cinnamon water in the afternoons. Penelope had long observed a steady glow from her upstairs window, 1 beeswax taper, always trimmed carefully, flame steady. But now, nothing. At first, Penelope assumed illness or travel, but on December 20th, she noticed something new. A dim glow in the downstairs hallway, not a candle. It flickered oddly, too faint and too sharp. Possibly a new lamp, a lantern? She noted it. House hash 18, new light source. No flicker, yellow-white. Window slightly fogged, shape unclear. She continued to watch it for the next several days. The light came and went at irregular hours, not the usual rhythm. She recorded each occurrence with patient attention, but added no speculation. On December 27th, the upstairs candle returned, just for an hour, a slightly taller taper, with a broader flicker. It guttered once, then steadied. Penelope watched from her blanket-covered chair and made a rare personal note. Light seems unfamiliar, likely new hand. It would later emerge that Mrs. Croom had taken ill, and her niece had come to stay. The niece had different habits, preferred oil lamps, lit fewer candles, often sat without light at all. Penelope never met her, but her presence was recorded nonetheless, through changes in glow, timing, and flame behavior. Elsewhere in town, the candle patterns remained steady. The Cooper's family at House hash 3 still burned tallow, thick and faintly smoky. The bookbinder at House Hash 9 used trimmed bayberry, sharp and clean burning, though occasionally prone to dripping. Penelope noted the trails of cooled wax down the sill. It wasn't an error. The house had been there for over a century, but Penelope had never once observed a candle in any of its windows. April 19th, 1845. All houses accounted for. House Hash 28, still dark, sky clear. My candle held steady. No one ever lit a candle in House Hash 28, not during Penelope's lifetime, and not afterward, only for a moment. The local glazier once asked which chimneys were least likely to release soot near dormer windows. Josiah provided a list. Spring chimneys, 1765. He had a small ink stamp, just the letter R, which he used for entries requiring return visits. He rarely spoke about his work, but once, while visiting the blacksmith for a broken monocular hinge, he quietly said, "Most people look at windows to know who lives inside. I look at the chimneys to know who stays." And then he left. By 1779, Josiah Bell's rooftop survey had expanded into what he referred to in his notes as the Rooftop Register, not an official document, nor publicly acknowledged, but a careful, evolving catalog of every rooftop, chimney, and related fixture in the town of Hemsley upon Wold. The rain-crooked pot of Hill Street was a minor local feature. To most, it was simply a chimney that leaned slightly to the left. To Josiah, it was a dependable subject. For nearly 8 years, he recorded its slight seasonal shifts, which he believed were due to expansion and contraction of the brick under persistent rainfall. Observation April 3rd, 1776, lean at 2.5 degrees. October 1st, 2.7 degrees. Pattern consistent. Brickwear along base suggests long exposure to runoff. He never climbed a roof. He believed in observation from distance and measurement by ratio. He used shadow lengths, plume heights, and sun angle to calculate dimensions. His monocular was refitted with a simple reticule, a set of etched lines that allowed for improved consistency. He also began to track soot shadows, those long black trails that stained roof tiles where smoke consistently passed over time. He recorded their width, curve, and feathering. He noted which chimneys produced the straightest soot lines and which wavered due to turbulent flue structures. He invented a term for this chimney handwriting. Each roof, to Josiah, had its own signature, a combination of angle, residue, and rhythm. He believed a trained eye could read the history of a home from its chimney pot. His notes were oddly poetic at times. The pot on Widow Merriweather's house sighs eastward again. Slight tilt, same as last spring. Soot rises in twinned ribbons. Separate but close, a comfortable pattern. He never shared these writings, but they appear frequently in the margins of his ledgers. Every Sunday, Josiah would revisit one block of roofs and check for changes. Sometimes he found a new pot installed. Sometimes, no change at all. He recorded both with equal care. One of his most frequently repeated entries reads, "No change since last, all as it was." This was not disappointment to him. It was confirmation. That final note, "Joy noted," appears only twice in his records. The town never took official interest in his work. Once, a traveling surveyor heard of Josiah Sipp's maps and asked to see them. Josiah declined, stating only that rooftops are private in a public way. Children began to mimic him for fun, pointing at chimneys and making up notes. That one's crooked. That one sneezes smoke. Josiah never corrected them. Sometimes he nodded and moved along. In 1785, he recorded a significant event, the installation of the first known metal chimney cap in Hemsley. By 1789, Josiah Bell's notebooks filled an entire corner of his home, lined up neatly in wooden trays, organized by direction of smoke and texture of plume. His eyesight, though still clear enough to trace outlines in the sky, had begun to soften at the edges. He moved more slowly now, pausing often at street corners, leaning on his walking stick just a moment longer than before. He had no apprentices, no plans to pass the work on. When the local magistrate SIP's clerk casually asked what would happen to the chimney project once Josiah was gone, he replied, "The chimneys will still be there." July 3rd, 1789, House Hash 2, South Row, same pair of clay pots, moss ring widened, smoke path unchanged, signature constant. And somewhere in the final volume, beside a drawing of a simple brick stack, someone had written, "Not manufacturing buttons, not collecting them, simply recording them, button by button, coat by coat, entry by entry, in a long series of cream-colored ledgers, known among archivists and no one else as the Fastenings Register of Linton, 1708, 1730. Each volume was labeled not by date, but by style. Volume I, Horn and Wood. Volume II, Pewter Bone and Shell. Thatch was not a tailor, nor was he particularly fashionable. He wore the same brown wool waistcoat nearly every day, and had only 2 jackets to his name, both buttoned with plain horn discs. But his interest in the buttons worn by others was precise, consistent, and oddly tender. He began in early spring of 1708, just after being appointed parish clerk, a role that involved record keeping, inventorying of church property, and organizing the yearly town accounts. That first week he attended the Wednesday vestry meeting and made a short notation in his margin. No one noticed. Mr. Lovell, butcher, linen smock, 5 bone toggles, irregular spacing, thumb worn, thread color, fawn. And so it began. Thatch carried a small folding notebook stitched into the inside of his satchel. Whenever he met someone, during a baptism registration, a tax assessment, or even while collecting choir dues, he would glance quietly and briefly at their front buttons. He never stared. He never touched. Just one glance. Then a mark. October 12th, 1716. Reverend Dobbs, cassock, with 12 jet buttons, highly polished, all intact, shine noted even in candlelight, likely cleaned with oil. To Edwin Thatch, a parish was not just a collection of souls, it was a landscape of closures, of tiny discs holding together fabric and form, quietly doing their work. The phrase earnest effort noted appears 43 times across his ledgers. He used it for any repair that showed care, regardless of neatness. Inversion present, functional, acceptable. Edwin Sipp's work remained almost entirely unnoticed by the world beyond Linton. A traveling bishop once glimpsed one of the ledgers and commented, "You seem to have a fascination with things that do not speak," to which Edwin replied, "They do speak, We sit just not been listening properly. Self, button 4, loose. Thread holding, no repair planned. He added it to the ledger, just as he had done for everyone else. The townspeople had grown used to him. Some still joked, but kindly. A few even checked their own coats before visiting the church, gently straightening their fastenings as they approached. One farmer Sit's wife, old Mrs. Prowse, once confessed during confession, not of sin, but of curiosity, that she had sewn on an extra button just to see if he Sit notice. Edwin had, of course, and noted it. March 19th. Mrs. Prowse, apron front, 6th button, new edition, poorly matched, whim suspected, stitch confident. He made no mention of motive, just fact and form. In the final volume, volume 13, labeled simply edges and ends, his entries became even more sparse, but not less careful. He often included notes about where thread worn thin, edges curled, fasteners dulled from decades of service. One recurring phrase emerged again and again, still serving. Thread aged, but true. He used it for old coats mostly, sometimes hats with small chin fasteners, occasionally for bodices kept mended across generations. But the tone felt more personal now, as if he was preparing the record not just for others, but for the archive itself. In the back of the final ledger, on a page he left blank for nearly 2 months, he made one last full entry. March 2nd, 1730, Miss Abigail Lowe, schoolmistress, cloak, with 3 cloth-covered buttons, slight rust on interior loop, threads uneven, fastening steady, likely self-sewn, still serving, thread aged but true. He underlined the last phrase only once. That spring, Edwin Thatch quietly retired from the vestry office. No ceremony, no announcement. He simply stopped arriving at the hour he used to, and after a few weeks, someone else was asked to take over the ledgers for parish births and burials. No one was asked to take over the button record. It was understood that that part of the parish's life belonged only to him. He died quietly, in August of that year, at home, in the same brown wool waistcoat he'd worn for decades, all 4 buttons still attached, the bottom one still loose. His belongings were modest. His only written request was that the ledgers remain with the church for future reference should fastenings fall from memory. They were placed in a box marked Clerk E. Thatch, 1708, 1730, and stored in the vestry under the window. Over the years, the ink faded, and the paper curled slightly at the corners, but the observations remained clear. Later visitors, mostly historians with soft voices and time to spare, would remark on the sheer detail of the entries. Some called it eccentric, others a quiet triumph of attention, but most simply sat with the ledgers for a while, quietly flipping through page after page of buttons that once fastened ordinary lives. Plain horn, slightly chipped, pinned, as if to say this one held it all together. He underlined the last phrase only once. That spring, Edwin Thatch quietly retired from the vestry office. No ceremony, no announcement. He simply stopped arriving at the hour he used to, and after a few weeks, someone else was asked to take over the ledgers for parish births and burials. No one was asked to take over the button record. It was understood that that part of the parish's life belonged only to him. He died quietly, In August of that year, at home, in the same brown wool waistcoat he'd worn for decades, all 4 buttons still attached, the bottom one still loose. His belongings were modest. His only written request was that the ledgers remain with the church for future reference, should fastenings fall from memory. They were placed in a box marked Clerk, E. Thatch, 1708-1730, and stored in the vestry under the window. Over the years, the ink faded, and the paper curled slightly at the corners, but the observations remained clear. Later visitors, mostly historians with soft voices and time to spare, would remark on the sheer detail of the entries. Some called it eccentric, others a quiet triumph of attention, but most simply sat with the ledgers for a while, quietly flipping through page after page of buttons that once fastened ordinary lives. And on the inside cover of the final book, tucked inside the back flap, a single button had been stitched into the binding. Plain horn, slightly chipped, pinned, as if to say this one held it all together.